WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. Still broadcasting in high-quality mono sound at AM 1570. Make sure you're placing a little place on your radio dial for us, a little setting, 1, 2, 3. I'll even be number 6. It's fine with me. It's all brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Lottery. We're going to be doing our Maryland Crab Cake Tour on Friday this week. We're going to be at Fadley's downtown in Lexington Market. Come one, come all. Last chance to be in the old market. It's the last remaining part of the old market. They'll be getting over to Catonsville and into the new market as well at Fadley's. I think Dan Rodricks is going to be stopping by. Big tip of the cap to Dan. Unbelievable show that he put together last week. My longtime friend from the Baltimore Sun. An incredible stage production called Baltimore, You Have No Idea. I cried 3 times. I laughed 100 times. It was an amazing night. Dan's going to be with us on Friday. All brought to you by our friends at Goodwill in conjunction with our friends at Window Nation, 866-90-NATION. Looking out the window here, Luke, we're watching these other teams now, right? Like we watched Dallas look good on Sunday night against a bad team without a real head coach. But the 4 o'clock games, we watched Cincinnati and Kansas City fight to the bitter end. We're watching these other games, Minnesota and the Jets. Dolphins didn't look so good up in Philadelphia, or excuse me, the Titans didn't look so good in Philadelphia. The good teams and trying to separate who's good and who's not at this point. Certainly on the other side in the NFC, Philadelphia continues to win. And in the AFC, it's going to be much more of a dogfight, but the Garoppolo injury in San Francisco certainly changes their prospects. Where the Ravens are, we talk so much about Lamar being injured and how it changes the Ravens' prospects. Thing always looks different a week later in the National Football League, doesn't it?
Things can change very quickly. I mean, everyone was talking about Jimmy Garoppolo, and I mean, there had even been a report over the weekend about those sides staying together after 2022. And I'm not saying that won't still happen, but he breaks his foot and he's out for the year. And now we're getting to know Brock Purdy, who the puns will be we're already flowing on Sunday and will continue as well as as long as he's playing and playing, I guess, somewhat well.
That's my mother's favorite word, by the way, this time of year. I would take her out. My mother didn't see well. She was like Mrs. Magoo. Mm-hmm. So we would take her to the mall and, walking through Macy's or Nordstrom, whatever, she would go up to stuff and she would touch it and get real close to it and touch it. And she'd look at me and she'd say, "That's Purdy." So that's what she would say. So there you
go. The Purdy Christmas lights. There you
Absolutely.
go. So, but I mean, it does speak to how dramatically things can change. And we've talked at length about the Ravens with Lamar Jackson and his health and what that's going to mean for the offense, what that's going to mean for this football team. I think if nothing else, it's going to put even more pressure on this defense to turn in more performances like it had on Sunday, which, let's face it, and I'm not going to back down from the criticism that I laid on this defense for the way that it played in the fourth quarter against Jacksonville a week ago. I want to see this defense play at a higher level against better competition, but they went out and they performed the way they should against the Broncos offense that was last in the NFL in scoring. They held them to 9 points, and 3 of those points were basically gifted with the Tyler Huntley interception. So they're going to need more of that. And that's not to say that you're going to hold Cincinnati or Kansas City or Buffalo or Miami in the playoffs to 9 points or 13 points or anything like that, but this defense is going to have to continue to do heavy lifting because we've been saying it, even before Lamar gets hurt on Sunday, offense isn't clicking the way that it should be or the way that it can when it's at its best. And that was the case before Lamar got hurt, coming out of the bye week and seeing what they did against Carolina, seeing the red zone issues that they had against the Jaguars until the fourth quarter where they finally found some traction. But this defense is going to have to rise to the occasion because when you're talking about missing your franchise quarterback and you don't have your left tackle out there, although I think this week is more realistic for Ronnie Stanley since he did practice some this past week. So I think he's going to be back sooner rather than later. But talked about the lack of pass catchers and playmakers on the offensive side of the football. Who knows what's going to happen with J.K. Dobbins and how he'll look as he nears his return to the field. But this defense, they're not at full health, and clearly we'll see if Patrick Queen's going to miss some time here with what was a pretty scary looking thigh bruise, and I could tell you he could barely walk leaving the locker room, but he was walking, so that was a good sign. But could be a situation where we might see him miss a little bit of time here. But Yeah, this defense has a lot of resources pumped into it, and they're going to have to come up big, especially over these next couple weeks where we're talking about AFC North road games, potentially without your franchise quarterback, knowing that this team offensively is trying to figure it out. They're going to need their defense to come up big, as it did on Sunday. With, really my only complaint, my only critique would be, we're starting to see some of the what we saw earlier in the season, where I'd like to see the 2-minute defense be tighter. They gave up points at the end of the half, end of the first half with the McManus field goal, and certainly you don't want to see Denver, even if it was a 63-yard field goal. They did that in a matter of 28 seconds. You'd like to see that situational football be a little bit better for the defense, but by and large, you give up 9 points, 3 field goals over the course of a 60-minute ball game, and I get it. Russell Wilson and the Broncos have been a disaster this year, but the Ravens needed their defense to be on point, and it was, for the most part, save for a couple big pass plays here and there. They tightened up when they needed to, holding Denver to 2 of 12 on third down. And let's face it, the Broncos did not get in the red zone once. So it speaks to the work that Mike McDonald's unit did once Denver got to that point where they were starting to get into Baltimore territory.
Boy, they were awful, weren't they? The Denver Broncos. I mean, like this, just when I look at what they, and I'm, winning 10-9, backup quarterback, all the problems the Ravens have. They're 8-4. So the narrative, as John Harbaugh would construct it for Ravens.com, is all is well. We're 8-4. We've won 2/3 of our football games. We're still in first place. We still control our own. All of that is there. They still have to play 4 of their last 5 games against the teams that know them the best, that know Lamar the best, that are most motivated to wreck the Ravens season without question. I mean, Cleveland and Pittsburgh are not going to roll over, even though they're not playoff teams. And obviously, by the time we get to Cincinnati a month from now, a lot of this will be borne out over the next 4 weeks as to Patrick Queen's health, whether the defense takes the ball away, whether they can pack their road bags and perform well in Pittsburgh and Cleveland in back-to-back weeks. This thing, as I wrote in my column this week, Luke, when the schedule came out, it looked like, well, Cleveland's going to stink. Pittsburgh's going to stink. Cleveland's got this billion-dollar quarterback who's, assaulting women. He's not going to play. And if he does, it's not going to be any good. I don't think he looked particularly great on Sunday, but he hadn't played in 700 days, for crying out loud. So he'll have a little training wheels under him by the time the Ravens get to him next weekend as well. Boy, these next 2 games and the next 4 out of 5, and I'm not even writing off Atlanta on short rest here on Christmas Eve, where no one's going to want to go to the game. All of that. None of these games are easy, especially with your backup quarterback, right? I mean, and a passing game that was bad when you had your real quarterback, and a running game that was somewhat suspect week to week, depending on who the front seven's going to be. Pittsburgh and Cleveland standing in the way. These franchises live for this. And as far as how the schedule makers made the AFC East all in September, and even that looked beneficial at the time, because you thought Jets stink, Dolphins stink, all of these Patriots won't be what they are, right? Like, this is when we all have them 15-2 when the season begins, right? They've only lost 4 games, man. We're getting up on Christmas. They're having a nice season, except everything's going wrong at the wrong time right now, including the schedule gods that looked soft to them. Pittsburgh is a better team today than they were 10 weeks ago. Cleveland is already a better team because they have a better quarterback, I think, right? And the weather conditions sort of play into all of that. This is an ugly pathway for the Ravens, because when we looked down 4 weeks ago and said 3-8, 4-7, 4-7, 3, win. These aren't wins. These are not wins at all. These aren't easy games.
Yeah, I mean, they could be wins. I think I'm certainly not expecting the Ravens to lose out. I don't think we're going to see a repeat of last year. I don't think, although we'll have to wait and see with Lamar's health and what everything else, how everything else looks on this football team. But you're right from the standpoint of Pittsburgh. I think, TJ Watt's back. That's been big. I even saw some splits, which, sometimes these kind of numbers can be cherry picking, but they've been a much better team. They've won more games with TJ Watt on the field than not, and we know what kind of player he is and what he means to that defense. Pickett, is he better than he was earlier in the season? I think it's fair to make that assumption, right? I mean, he's certainly not making anyone forget Ben Roethlisberger at this point, but certainly someone who was making progress and looking better.
He
I'm
hasn't
actually
played
going to
his way
beg to
off the
differ with
field,
you
right?
on.
He hasn't looked overmatched in that Spurgeon win kind of way. He looks like he could beat the Ravens next weekend playing with a backup quarterback. That's what it looks like to me.
Well, I mean, it just comes down to, I mean, what's the alternative? I mean, you're not going to go back to Mitch Trubisky or anything like that. He's done some nice things. He's had times where it's looked pretty ugly. So it's life as a rookie quarterback, typically. With some very rare exceptions. But I'll beg to differ with you a little bit on Cleveland. I'm not convinced they're better with Deshaun Watson at quarterback, at least right now. As I've said over and over and over, you go back and look at the Cleveland Browns this year. Jacoby Brissett was not their problem. He actually, relative to expectations, and I'm not saying he's a franchise quarterback and he's going to get a starting gig elsewhere necessarily, but he played some decent football for them. And there's a bar there that Deshaun Watson, after a 2-year absence, that he's going to have to clear. And he didn't clear it on Sunday against Houston. He was pretty bad. So now it's not to say he won't be better. Not saying that in a big picture sense they aren't better. I mean, for their sake, they better hope so. All the money they spent, considering all the grief that they have gotten, and rightfully so, for making that acquisition. But what does that look like in a couple of weeks? With him having another game under his belt. But your point about the AFC North is well taken. As much as we're talking about the Cincinnati Bengals right now and them beating the Chiefs and them having won 4 in a row, going from 4-4 to 8-4. When was the last time the Bengals lost? It was that hideous loss in Cleveland on Halloween. Well, the Browns are capable of doing that, right? So that's where, if you're the Ravens, you're right. I mean, nothing. Let's face it, nothing was coming easy, even with a healthy, or at least relatively healthy, let's say, Lamar Jackson. So not going to get any easier if Tyler Huntley's under center, and still wondering about Ronnie Stanley's health and Patrick Queen's health, and when Marcus Williams is coming back, and when J.K. Dobbins is coming back, and what about Gus Edwards? And he hasn't looked great since coming back from the hamstring. So none of this is a given. I mean, again, I'm not going to sit here and say I think the Ravens are doomed. I don't think that, but I'm not going to sit here and say that just going to, they're going to rack up the next 3 wins over the next 3 weeks and they're going to be fine. And Lamar's comes back healthy and they're going to roll to a division title. That could still play out that way, but it's a lot that's going to have to go well for them. And as I mentioned, that's where I keep coming back to. They're going to need their defense to really show up and play complete games. And they've done that against lesser opponents, and I think Pittsburgh, and to a lesser degree, but still, when you look at what Cleveland does best, it's running the football. We know that the Ravens have done a superb job stopping the run for the last several weeks. I mean, their run defense has been excellent. They're going to have to continue that because they're going to have to keep winning ugly. I mean, I think we can all agree on that at this point. This thing's not going to look pretty, at least for a couple more weeks here. I mean, maybe they can get going the last couple of weeks and build some momentum that way going into the playoffs. If they take care of business between now and then. But
if they can win 3 games with their backup quarterback
Pittsburgh,
between now and Christmas, I mean, that would be 2 games on the road and beat Atlanta, and they're 11-4. We're talking, you and I are getting together Christmas morning and talking about something other than Santa Claus if they've won these next 3 games the way that they were on schedule to when Lamar was beating everybody's ass 4 weeks ago, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tough, and we've talked about this for a while now. I mean, if they win ugly, then great, and that's a good thing. Does that change how I'm going to feel about their chances in January? No, not really, especially not knowing what Lamar will look like, whenever he comes back. And let's be clear, we don't know. He may only miss 1 game. He may be back sooner rather than later, or the MRI could show some concerns that might linger through the rest of the season, even if he is back on the field. So you just don't know. But what's tough for them is, other than Week 18 against Kansas or against Cincinnati, going into Cincinnati and playing the Bengals, and maybe the division's on the line, maybe not. Who knows, one way or the other. But none of these games are really going to provide an eyeball test, a litmus test, really. I mean, it's going to be a matter of just surviving these games and knowing that you have your backup quarterback and an offense that's sputtering, and you're trying to figure that out. And
a left tackle that's a turnstile at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so you just have to figure out. You just got to find ways to win, and that's not going to garner any attention. It's not going to garner headlines or adoration or a rise in the power rankings, most likely. but that really doesn't matter at the end. Now, that said, it doesn't mean I'm going to feel markedly better about them. If they're just barely beating Cleveland and barely beating Pittsburgh and barely beating the Atlanta Falcons, although the Falcons have, not impressive either. And Ravens are playing at home. So I feel better about that game than these next two at the very least. So, but I mean, it kind of is what it is. And you mentioned in one of our previous segments, when was the last time the Ravens really looked like that top shelf team for 60 minutes? And, I mentioned the New Orleans game, they were in control of that game beginning to end, but it's the Saints doing it against a playoff team. Let's say, you really do have to go back to, the early games of the season where, Lamar was humming, throwing the football, and we were talking more so about the running game at that point in time, but they were scoring a lot of points and forcing turnovers and doing those types of things. But they're 8-4. They have some serious question marks, as do a lot of teams, even other playoff teams out there. But these next few weeks, it's really going to be about survival. I mean, that's really what it is. They need their defense to play at a high level. They really, even more so now, and this was the case even before Lamar gets hurt, but the running game has to get going. And I mean the running backs carrying the football, not gadget plays, not scrambles from Tyler Huntley. They need their running backs to start running more efficiently, more explosively. And the offensive line's a big part of that. Let's be clear. I'm not just putting it all on the running backs, but that needs to rise up. And you think back to the end of last year when Lamar's out and Tyler Huntley's trying to play, and that running game that they had at that point, Devontae Freeman had some moments here and there. Latavius Murray had some moments here and there, but by and large, it wasn't anywhere close to where it had been the previous 2 years. And that hurt them in all those heartbreaking, narrow losses. I mean, you can't expect Tyler Huntley to go out there and give you magic. I mean, it's, it's not.
Well, that's my point for Pittsburgh this week and Cleveland next week. I'm assuming Lamar's not playing the next 2 weeks. That's just my assumption watching him walk in, is that he's not coming back before Atlanta. So that's my assumption. Maybe that's the wrong assumption 24 hours after the game, and that's cool. But if Tyler Huntley goes out and plays 60 in Pittsburgh, 60 in Cleveland, what are their chances of winning given what we saw on Sunday, which was not great? It was fine in the last drive. It was a little miraculous. But seeing there was a body of work last year, and I know you would say, well, their defense really stunk last year when Huntley came in because everybody was gone. And I'll agree with that they have another unit of football here that can take the ball away, change the game, shorten the game, get the ball back, score points on its own. Lord knows this defense, tackle great, but they strip well. You know what I mean? They're always looking to punch the football. And at some point, when you punch the football 35, 40 times a game, twice it pops out. Sometimes you fall on it. Sometimes the ball rolls out of bounds. Sometimes they fall on the football. But I think the defense is much more poised to get them through this period of time, the next week or 2 or 3, however long. I mean, you mentioned Atlanta and you just urinate on them like they can't win. Well, that's probably because the defense is going to have to be a big part in that game, because I just don't see Tyler Huntley chucking the ball around and running an offense here that's going to look like a National Football League offense. I really don't. I don't think he's a capable National Football League quarterback to win games. And I think over a 17-game season, if Tyler Huntley played, you'd be screaming to bring back Matt Schaub or Tyrod Taylor at this point.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I think he's proving himself to be a capable NFL quarterback now. Is he a legitimate, serious starting candidate? Whether it's, somewhere else or, who knows what happens.
Not for a team that wants to win 10, 12 games.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of that just has to do with he was an undrafted rookie, right? I mean, a lot of that has to do with he's a backup. I mean, we just perceive these types of guys as being backup quarterbacks. Now, that said, I don't think their offense is so bad that they're not a legitimate NFL offense with him at the helm. That doesn't mean they're a top 10 or a top half of the league kind of offense, but I think they can, with his mobility and how they're designed to operate anyway, I think they can still function at a high enough level. But that doesn't mean you're going to go out there and score 30 points. So brings us back to a lot of this needing to come back on the defense. And I'm glad you mentioned it. And I mentioned it in what I wrote at BaltimorePositive.com as far as the Ravens really being in a tough spot now to kind of fight off that feeling of deja vu because of the timing of this injury, just the uncertainty with Jackson and when he's going to be back on the field and what he's going to look like when he does return. But you do have a healthier roster overall. You're not in a position where Ronnie Stanley's gone for the year and J.K. Dobbins is gone for the year and Gus Edwards is gone for the year and Marcus Peters is gone for the year and Marlon Humphrey is gone for the year. Need I continue or do we get the point? They are in a much healthier spot and they still have a couple more guys on the way in terms of reinforcements. As I mentioned, Marcus Williams a few minutes ago. And they have a defense that is in a much better position than it was at this time a year ago, which was a defense that competed and gave them a chance in some games, but we saw typically it was a defense that wasn't able to get the job done at the end. But this is where I will still lay down that challenge. And we saw that the defense fall woefully short in the fourth quarter against Jacksonville. You got to play 60 minutes. This, especially now with Tyler Huntley and not having the upside that Lamar Jackson brings, whether the Ravens were realizing that currently in the present day or not, whether they had done that in recent weeks or not, we all would agree this offense has way more upside and potential with Lamar Jackson on the field than not. I mean, that's the Captain Obvious statement. So it becomes that much more important for the defense to be able to play a full 60 minutes. Not this, you play a great first quarter or a great 3 quarters and then you will. So that's where these road games, playing on the road in the AFC North, and as you mentioned, Pittsburgh looking better and Cleveland, whether Deshaun Watson's an upgrade or not, long term, he has more upside than Jacoby Brissett in a vacuum, even though Watson hasn't played in a couple years. And I think that's relevant to the conversation as it pertains to 2 weeks from now. But these are AFC North games. And as you mentioned, they know you better than any other opponent and vice versa. So this is where that defense that has some players making some really good money and players that were very early draft picks, they've got to rise to the occasion because this isn't going to be a case, even when Lamar comes back, until we see he is right and 100%, you hope, and there's no lingering effects for the knee. And I'm not saying whether that's the case or not. We just won't know until he's back out there. You can't expect Lamar to just put on the cape and rescue everyone. And, so they're in a position now where they need every other phase of the game to be that much better. And this is where I transition. I want to give a quick nod because we beat them up a week ago and Devin Duvernay having some of his issues returning the ball. And we've talked about Jordan Stout being up and down. Their special teams played at a very high level on Sunday. And that was big for them. Whether you're talking about Stout with some of the punts inside the 20, whether you're talking about the kick and punt coverage, we saw Daryl Worley, right off the bat with a big tackle and kick coverage. We saw Kevon Seymour, with some good kick coverage. I mean, that's an area of the game that the Ravens take a lot of pride in, sometimes to the detriment of the rest of the roster, according to some people. We've all talked about guys that have been on this roster and backups where you say, well, is he really giving you much on offense or defense? Well, the Ravens will tell you, well, he's a great special teams player. So the Ravens have what is considered one of the very best special teams operations yet again this year. Last Sunday in Jacksonville notwithstanding, they came up big against Denver. They're going to need that to continue. They're going to need those types of performances. Everyone else is going to have to be that much more on their P's and Q's as far as paying attention to detail and not making mistakes. And something we did see on Sunday that they were able to overcome, not turning the ball over and not committing too many penalties. Those are the types of things that you never want to do anyway. But when you're talking about your backup quarterback needing to fill in for an undetermined period of time, you've got to be really precise in all those other details. You have to be really on point with all those other aspects of the game because you're not going to have Lamar Jackson doing his highlight thing, at least for, we assume, a little while here. So, you do have to do what it takes to win, and that involves playing smart, mistake-free football as much as you can, and that's going to be the challenge for this team now as they go on the road these next 2 weeks.
Luke Jones is here. He will be there in Owings Mills all week long. It's all brought to you by our friends at Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast. Luke will be in Owings Mills getting you ready for Pittsburgh week around here. And, of course, a visit to the Confluence as we continue to watch and monitor. Anything you want to say about the Terps? You had a little Terps fever over the weekend, right? It's exciting when in December you feel like they're at least going to be a formidable team. They might be better than that, right? They're a top 25 team right now. They're winning games. They're winning big games. Scott Van Pelt's all fired up. I invited him on the show this week. That's kind of a fun little aside for if this thing peters out and Lamar's hurt and they stumble into the playoffs and they can't win in the tournament. At least there is something to get us to opening day, because the Terps have been the last couple of years not nearly as exciting as they've been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, for most of the Mark Turgeon era, let's call a spade a spade. It was pretty quick, and we've talked about this even at the end of the Gary Williams era. You know, some of that rigorous enthusiasm that you had back in the early 2000s, the late 90s, hadn't been there quite as much, save for the Gravis Vasquez's, the end of his run.
Turgeon had a good team or two. I mean, the Diamond stuff, a couple of those teams.
The mercenary Sweet 16 team, yeah, the hired gun team. But even that team, let's face it, that team kind of peaked in December and January, way more than feeling like that team was a serious national championship contender or a serious, a team that you really felt like it could win it all. And even that Sweet 16 team, that was a very favorable draw they got in the first and second round that year, if you recall. But with Kevin Willard, I love the attitude. I love the fact that he has not shied away from what he thinks this program can be, what it has been in the past, and what he thinks it can be again. I think you see a group of players that, whether you're talking about, the Dante Scotts that have hung around, or whether you're talking about a Jameer Young, a local kid who, was playing at Charlotte and now he's, come to the Terps and was more of a combo guard, playing more of a point guard position, which, I thought Kevin Willard made mention of this recently, talking about Jameer Young, where he's like, you're going to be a point guard in the Big Ten. You're going to be a point guard professionally, so you need to make that transition. And I loved hearing a coach talk in those terms about a player, not just act like your program is the only thing that exists on earth. He's talking about Jameer Young becoming a better player in the big picture for him as a professional, wherever he ends up playing, Europe, whatever it is. But Friday night against Illinois, I mean, lots of excitement. It was great seeing the arena sold out, and certainly attendance, even in some of these early games, had been a point of contention with not many people going to these games. But College Park was filled to the gills, and Jameer Young with the big three. I mean, that was fun. This is a team that expectations weren't terribly high. I think it's important to still keep some of those expectations in check as they get into Big Ten play, and they've got some tough games coming up here over the next week or two. But it's fun. And I thought before the season, if Kevin Willard can get this team to the NCAA tournament in his first year, knowing that, you got transfers and some holdovers from the Turgeon era, and it's not really his team yet in terms of, a full-blown couple recruiting classes. If he can get that team to the dance, if they can win one game, great. That would be awesome.
Well, just bringing back belief, right? Like Friday night's the first time in a long time my Maryland people are activated in a positive way. I mean, for 3 years it was fire Turgeon
right
after every loss, even when they won big games, and they didn't win a lot of them, but when they
didn't win too many, right? Sure.
Right. I mean, there was he's toast, and we never had that during the Gary. Like, it has not been a fire the coach program, like, ever, right? It's like the Ravens. We don't hear fire Harbaugh from idiots, we do, but this hasn't been a fire the coach kind of place. It became that for a couple of years. Now that's over with. This guy's here. He's going to get paid next fight. He's going to have a chance to build something that they've won a big game to give some hope early on. That even if they don't perform all that great, there at least was that. There was that moment where he's getting everybody on the ship to some degree, which Turgeon had a really hard time doing all along, really. Turgeon never really had everybody on the ship.
No. And frankly, I don't think he did a very good job with that part of the job either. I think it was much more what we've done is good enough rather than how are we getting better. And I think Kevin Willard, look, it's easy. He's still in the honeymoon period, right? But when you have a team that gets off to the kind of start that the Terps have gotten off to, which is winning games and blowing out lesser teams, winning convincingly against some of the lesser opponents, and even a couple opponents, they beat Miami, they beat St. Louis, who many think is a tournament team. So it's not as though they had just feasted on tomato cans, prior to Illinois on Friday night. But just you just said it, and the fact that you and I, in the aftermath of a Ravens ugly win in which Lamar Jackson gets hurt, are even giving 10 or 15 minutes of conversation about Terps basketball in early December, that says something. And again, it speaks to some renewed enthusiasm, some renewed hope, and we'll see how it plays out. They're not going to go undefeated. We know that they're going to lose some games at some point, but it's certainly it's exciting, and it allows you to start believing once again that, hey, they've got a new coach in here, someone who wanted this job, someone who is excited to be in College Park, someone who is not turning away from expectations when he's talking about, hey, we need to win Big Ten conference titles, and we need to contend for national championships at some point. He hasn't shied away from that, rather than just saying.
Also, he realizes he can do that here and be here 20 years, and this can be his job for life. I don't think he's here looking for the UCLA job. He's here thinking this is a big job, that this is a big job. You can win here if you recruit right in the DMV. You don't have to play Duke and Carolina, but you do have to get on a plane and fly out to Northwestern and Iowa and Minnesota in the middle of the night. That's the new world of college basketball. None of these jobs are great, and obviously with the portal and the NIL, the nonsense new to all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw back at the Ripken senior luncheon, two coaches, him and the Villanova coach, talking about this NIL thing as though we're going to Mars. We have no idea how this is going to affect this program. I don't think Pat Scarry understands how it's going to affect Towson, or Juan's going to affect how it's going to affect Coppin, our partner here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, not to get too much into it, but just in a general sense, I think the NIL thing is just fascinating in terms of something I've thought about a lot, and I don't cover college sports that closely. There was a time when I covered the Terps more closely than just you and I talking about the games, but I'm fascinated to see how it's going to play out in terms of, you kind of think about these big programs that are kind of in the middle of nowhere. Take Penn State, for example. Central Pennsylvania, not particularly close to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. It's kind of smack dab in the middle where there's a whole lot of nothing, but it's at least a big enough area where I'm sure, those players are getting local endorsements and things of that nature. How does that compare to somewhere like Maryland, where you say, all right, big market, Baltimore, DC, but then you start thinking, oh yeah, there's also a ton of professional sports teams in smack dab in the middle of the same market. How does that relate for players and NIL opportunities compared to somewhere where, it's a smaller market, but there's no real competition, right? Penn State's the only game in town in Happy Valley, right? I mean, they got a minor league baseball team. That's about it. So, it really is fascinating in that regard. And I think for Kevin Willard, there's navigating that just like any program is trying to figure that out, as we're still talking about the very the infancy of NIL and what that's going to mean. But I think one positive, encouraging sign is how he's made use of the transfer portal in his first year. That's going to continue to be a thing. Even for the bigger programs, you're going to have to effectively utilize that. And it's a great way to, in a way, it's almost like when you think about the trade deadline for professional sports teams and free agency and things of that nature, which, college hasn't really had transfers be as prevalent as what we're seeing now. It's always been there, but there was always sitting out a year and all that,
there's also the stigma. You just pissed on Suleiman and Diamond Stone a couple of minutes ago. Like literally there was a, what's wrong with that kid? Why is he trying? That's over with now, right?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately I still think recruiting and getting your own guys and getting guys to buy in, whether they end up being a 4-year player or whether they're a 1 or 2 years and go to the NBA kind of talent, that's still to me going to be paramount. But yeah, how does the transfer portal factor into your roster building on a year-to-year basis? If you have someone who jumps a year earlier to the NBA or to the professional level than you anticipated, how can you plug that gap in your roster, so to speak? So it's going to be fascinating to see that. But like I said, just seeing what Jameer Young has done at this point, we'll see. He's not a big kid, so it's going to be interesting to see, as they get deeper into Big Ten play, how it translates. But he had a big shot on Friday night, and seeing the crowd reaction to that, and seeing the videos on Twitter, and I saw Tyus Bowser was there, for example, on Friday night.
A star is born.
It was fun. That was fun. And, seeing Terps basketball being talked about in early December, you know, not too many times we've been doing that here in recent years. So we'll see how it continues, and certainly an encouraging start to the Kevin Willard era. That's for
I
sure.
sort of like it because I had Walt Williams on the show last week. Tom McMillan's going to come on this week. We're going to be banging around doing some turf stuff. Anything you want to say on the Orioles on the signing of the free agent pitcher? I mean, they need to sign somebody. I don't know what the difference between a Kevin Millwood and I go through the list of all of the Ubaldo Jimenez's and money that's thrown out there. I defer to you on this because you watch more baseball than me these days.
Yeah, I mean the signing, or the agreement in principle for a 1-year deal with Kyle Gibson, a 35-year-old starting pitcher, was an all-star a couple years ago. Albeit wasn't a frontline kind of all-star, but
A
still
lot
made
of
an all-star team
35-year-olds
nonetheless.
were all-stars a couple of years ago.
But it just speaks to that he pitched well 2 years ago, not quite as well this year. But I view this, and if this proves to be the case, that as long as this isn't what they were talking about in terms of a free agent pitcher, if this is part of adding another free agent pitcher who fits in somewhere into the top half of the rotation, and you're talking about Kyle Gibson being a cheaper, upgraded version of Jordan Lyles based on the option that they declined at the start of free agency for him in 2023, then I'm fine with it. It's not a do cartwheels kind of move. You're talking about a guy that, in a best case scenario will give you, an ERA somewhere, maybe in the low fours, something like that. And he can eat innings for you, which you still need, especially when you're talking about some of these young pitchers, and John Means probably not being ready till maybe June, and Grayson Rodriguez going to be on some kind of a managing innings kind of deal. You're going to need someone like that, and even the Phillies would tell you that. Well, Kyle Gibson, you look at his ERA, it was right around 5, I guess it was. He sucked up a lot of innings for them over the course of a 162 game season, and there's still value to that, especially if you have run into some health concerns with your rotation at some point. So I don't want it to be the acquisition in their starting rotation, but if this is the secondary kind of precursor move to signing another pitcher, and I don't expect it to be, I wasn't expecting it to be Jacob deGrom. I'm not expecting it to be Justin Verlander, but someone that is clearly better than Kyle Gibson, then I'm fine with it. But if this ends up being the free agent move they make to acquire a veteran pitcher, and that's kind of it, then I'll be piling on just like anyone else that was not exactly thrilled with the move over the weekend. So see how it plays out. Obviously, winter meetings this week. Perhaps you and I will reconvene if there's some significant news, and that's when we encourage everyone to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. But we'll see. Mike Elias, he said at the trade deadline last year, it's liftoff from here. We'll see exactly what that means over the next week, over the next couple months, and as we move closer and closer to spring training in February.
I have a feeling Mrs. Angelos is not going to be checking off on $100 million deals. That's literally that's my gut instinct on this, is that you are in fantasy land if you think they're going to really spend money, commit money that they don't have. There's no season tickets to back it up. There's no sponsorship to back it up. And Mama Angelos, it has to go to her desk, and she is the one signing. Yeah, we're going to add 40 million in payroll. I don't believe that's going to happen, Luke. I really don't. I would be shocked if that happens. Of course, I don't know much about Mrs. Angelos other than I'm guessing she's probably very conservative financially right now.
Yeah, and again, we've talked about it. There's a wide range between where the payroll was in 2022 and having a $250 million payroll, which of course they're not going to have. Certainly not going to have that one-off season. Even if they eventually have someone who rides in on a white horse and says, I'm going to spend money to make the Baltimore Orioles the best team in baseball. But that doesn't mean they can't spend some money. And I think, that doesn't mean that there isn't some semblance of a, I don't know, $70 million contract over 4 years, 5 years, whatever it ends up looking like. I'm not going to say that that's not on the table, but hey, skepticism is warranted until this organization shows otherwise. As much as I've loved what Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and the baseball ops have done in terms of rebuilding this organization from a farm system standpoint, from a player development standpoint, from an international market standpoint. Love all those things. Plenty to be positive about, legitimately, until we see them spending money, until we see Mike Elias get the go-ahead to spend money to augment the major league roster, meaningful money, not talking one-year deals, then people have a right to take a wait and see approach and a little bit more of a skeptical mindset because, hey, we've seen it over the last few years, and just saw what Disney with the BAM the deal that's going to put even more millions into the pockets of MLB owners. So we know that money's coming in. It's just going to be a matter of how much Mike Elias is enabled to potentially spend this offseason. And let's face it, this is a team that's coming off of a really fun 2022, and let's see this thing augmented. Let's see some pieces to supplement what they have in a really exciting young core. So we'll see what happens this week, and we'll see what happens here as we move deeper into the offseason.
Winter meetings in the sunshine. You got to love that. Luke Jones is here. He's Baltimore Luke. It's all brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Lottery. We're going to be doing the Maryland Crab Cake Tour again this week, back on it after Thanksgiving. I ate all my pumpkin pie and leftovers. I need a crab cake down at Fadley's. We're going to be at Fadley's on Friday morning. Dan Rodrigues, amongst others, joining us. Amy's going to be with us down at Fadley's talking about shipping crab cakes to you, to your relatives, anywhere in the country. And we'll be talking about that with all of our great sponsors, including our friends at Costas next week. Next Thursday, the Maryland Crab Cake Tour presented by the Maryland Lottery in conjunction with Goodwill and Window Nation. We're going to be in Dundalk celebrating 31 years of radio. December 13th is my 31st anniversary. This will be on the 15th. Next Thursday, we'll be at Costas in Dundalk in the afternoon. Gina Schock from the Go-Go's, Hall of Famer, John Allen, a whole bunch of rock and rollers. I got some Hammerjacks friends coming over as well, talking about the new Hammerjacks documentary. So it's going to be a nasty rock and jock and holiday. Santa might even show up, and we're definitely going to have a crab cake, maybe some crab imperial, because I want to feel like a king on my 31st anniversary. That is next Thursday at Costas. Big holiday doings. Luke covering all the bases with baseball. Terps are relevant again, and it's Pittsburgh week, and our backup quarterback's playing. I'm Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570. Towson, Baltimore, continuing the narrative for head coach John Harbaugh. We are BaltimorePositive.com.